Will we be able to see people?
All right.
I'm going to call Reverend Ray. I texted her, but haven't gotten a response. I don't know about Rock.
All right, we have attendees coming on up.
Can we see them?
No, unfortunately, it's a webinar feature, so you won't be able to see attendees. They'll be able to see you, though.
God forbid.
So are we live right now?
We are currently live and recording.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, perfect. Yes, one moment, I see you. Hello. Oh, Nicole, how you doing? 1 second. There.
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, so right now, Nicole and Rachel, I'm going to be giving you also specific links for the opening session after this session, because this webinar is going to close and then another one's going to open up. So I'm going to send you.
Yeah, you were sending links for like all day. So unless anything's changed since, let's see, the 21st, we have all the links.
Yep, I'm going to send that to you right now. One moment. So, Nicole and Rachel, this is that link for you.
Perfect, thank you.
No problem. And 1 minute till 8 o'clock. We're still waiting for, oh, perfect. Ray came in. And I think we're waiting for one more, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Perfect.
We'll continue to reach out to our final panelist, so we don't want to delay the presentation start.
Okay. All right. So at 8 o'clock, I'll start my script.
Thanks so much, Freddie.
No problem. Okay. I'm going to.
Freddie, will you be giving us a cue to when to start?
Yeah, I actually have a script at 8 o'clock I'll be saying, which will be doing the introductions.
Okay.
And copying and pasting text for everyone to see. And after that, you can start the whole thing. It's 8 o'clock. Hello, we are now going to begin. My name is Freddie Coopin Ames with the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, and I will be serving as the production assistant for today's session. Feel free to send a message in the chat if you have any questions or need support. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Freddie, and thank you and good morning to the Congress of Neighborhood Councils and thank you for inviting us to share Black Lives Matters LA and the People's Budget LA's positions and information on participatory budgeting and reimagining public safety. And I want to thank my friend Raquel Beltran, who I've known for many years. We're here to share with you what we've learned when we ask people, when we listen to people, and when we engage people. We're here to ask you to rethink, reconsider, and reimagine a better LA, where we invest in our people, where we invest in communities, and we invest in neighborhoods. Black Lives Matters was started 7 years ago in response to the not guilty verdict of George Zimmerman and the murder of Trayvon Martin, and as an abolitionist organization. The first chapter of Black Lives Matters Global was Black Lives Matters Los Angeles. Black Lives Matters was formed to end state-sanctioned violence in all its forms, social, political, and economic. Black Lives Matters has focused on police accountability, justice for the families, and real transformative change. And we're here today because really of Black death, the death of George Floyd, Ezell Ford, Breonna Taylor, Grishario Mack, Waukesha Wilson, Ahmaud Arbery, and other Black people killed by police violence. We aren't here because of an enlightened leadership, but because millions of outraged people took to the streets and supported the demands to end white supremacy, institutional racism, individual bigotry, and mass denial. And to make a simple statement clear and real that Black lives matter. We are going to cover the day, if you can move to the agenda, the history of the people's budget, the budget as a moral document, processes and outcomes, and reimagining public safety, and then a call to action. And then we want to engage with you in question and answers. Let's move to the next one. The history of the people's budget. The people's budget was started in a response to the fact that Black people were dying at twice our population share from COVID-19 in Los Angeles County. And interlocking economic, political, and social injustice collided with long-standing patterns of medical racism to make COVID-19 a Black issue that demanded a response specific to the needs of the Black community. And over 50 Black organizations came together to make a simple demand that we needed to be included and that we needed to know what the statistics were in our community. That then led to, if you move on, the formation of the People's Budget LA. And these are our coalition members, the groups that participate with us, the groups that support us, and the groups that have helped us be in contact with people in our communities. Next. Here is the timeline, if you will, of the People's Budget LA. The foundation of the People's Budget LA, BLM and allies repeatedly sounded the alarm on outsized spending of LAPD and the murder of over 618 people by police in LA County. The Black demands in April 2020. BLM and other more than 50 Los Angeles community leaders released Black LA demands calling for investment to ensure Black residents have resources in light of COVID-19. In May of 2020, BLM covered and convened the People's Budget LA Coalition, the People's Budget surveys released, town halls commenced. May 25th, George Floyd murdered by police in Minnesota. The defund the police became a clarion call. June 2020, City Council presentation. We made a presentation before the City Council on reimagining and looking at the services and research that we had done and engaged in, and the response from the City Council. The next one. July to September, town halls and direct actions. And you can see from the town halls and the direct action, that's where we went to people. That's where we asked people. That's where we heard people. And that's where we moved people. October, the participatory budgeting pledge. We circulated among candidates a pledge that they would engage in participatory budgeting and hold sessions to do so. January through April of 2021, town halls and more participatory budgeting. Once again, we have spent a lot of time, energy, and effort going to the people, listening to the people, asking the people, engaging the people. April 2021, preparing the budget proposal. There have been a budget proposal that was prepared by the mayor, and we developed our own based upon our own research, and we had our first national budget call. May 2021, we did our budget advisory. The People's Budget LA Coalition attended budget meetings and continued advocating with the City Council to make recommendations based on our data. Next one, please. Thank you. June 2021, demanding a just budget. The police budget went up again this year. We released 3 demands to amend the budget to defund the police, advance the no new cops motion, and fund Black-led organizations. July 2021, no new cops motion advocacy. The BLM and the People's Budget Coalition had been advocating for the budget chair to agendize the Bonin-Raman no new cops motion. August 2021, national call to action. Throughout the year, Black Lives Matter's Global Network convened people's budget campaigns around the country. And in August, we held an urgent call to take action for the defund the police demands regarding the federal budget. And then finally, in September, community engagement and research. The People's Budget LA Coalition continued to engage the community members in participatory sessions as we prepared for the 2022 and 23 budget cycle. Next, please. Here's some of the things that we have accomplished, that we achieved, that we set out to do. We collected over 25,000 responses to the 2020 People's Budget LA survey. Council members Wesson and Martin motion on moving nonviolent calls away from police. $150 million cut to the LAPD budget and $250 million pledged to Black and Brown communities. Councilmember Bonin and Harris motion to bar police from traffic and transportation stops. We participated with other allies in getting 35% of the budget for police from LAUSD cut. We passed Measure J that reduced and redirected 10% of county funding to community services, successfully directed city budget to Black communities through local Black-led organizations, and finally the Bonin-Raman no new cops motion. Next. Here is a vivid example of what we have been pushing back against, what we are saying we need to reimagine, what we need to rethink. The mayor has allocated 4.9% of the unrestricted revenue to the LAUSD, LAPD rather. LAPD is getting $3.1 billion of our city budget. And as you can see, what other resources are starved. And it means that we in our communities, because we know what keeps us safe and it's resources, and we know how we can use those resources, but our communities are being starved of those resources. Next, please. When the mayor's allocated billions to the police, the city can't pay for the support people need. And you can see, I mean, emergency management, parks and rec, transportation, housing. If you look at this bar, you can see what they are getting versus what the LAPD is getting. Next. Mayor Garcetti has increased LAPD's budget every year since he took office. This is not a justice budget. He called it that, but we push back. We don't accept that. And the people's demand for a just budget. And we made that point. And we were in the streets almost every day throughout 2021, demanding the divest, invest, and that we defund the police. Next. This movement comes from Black LA demands and is led by Black organizations and leaders. We can all come together in solidarity to fight for a more just budget. Next. I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Ray Young, who is Senior Organizing for Housing Now, a member of Clergy for Black Lives, and the Presbyterian of the Pacific rather. Reverend Ray, would you take it over and talk about the budget as a moral document?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Baba Akili, for your presentation. Now, you all might be wondering why we have a section in our presentation on the budget is a moral document. Well, that's because that's precisely what budgets are. Budgets reflect our values and our dreams. Just think about your budget at home for yourself and your family. And in the case of a city budget, the budget reflects who we are, our values as a collective, and the kind of community that we want to be. Now, we say that we are a democracy, that all are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But you know, and I know the truth, that the policies we have had in the history of this country, in the history of this city, have instead continued to enslave and oppress those who have arrived powerless, those who arrived in a ship and in chains, and those we colonized and displaced to claim its wealth for our own. And you know, and I know, that money doesn't lie. That no matter how many times we might say or hold a sign that says Black Lives Matter, Black lives do not in fact matter until we put our money where our mouth is, until the budget reflects those values and the kind of community we truly want to be. Now, friends, I know it is not solely your decision where the money goes, because it is our decision. What we are inviting you to do is to join us in changing history. Join us in transforming how it is that we make decisions and transforming how we live and thrive together as a community. What you will hear today in this presentation is that what is radical about participatory budgeting is that it centers the voices of the people in the budget decision-making process. It is democracy at its best, bringing the people and the government together to create real lasting solutions to our real problems here on the ground, here in our city, here in the structures of the fabric of our society. It is democracy at its best, not behind closed doors among a few elected people, but in the center of our communities, in the center of our neighborhoods, in the center of our neighborhood council meetings, facilitated by you who are our neighbors and our friends and our own. It is democracy at its best, by the people and for the people. And in this presentation today, you will hear from the people, because the people know what the people need. And what you will hear over and over again is that the people want homes, not cops. The people want jobs, not cops. The people want schools, not cops. The people want healthy food and parks and clean water and clean air and less traffic. And the thing is, the most beautiful thing is, we can have it all. California has the largest economy and population in the country, with Los Angeles the largest city in our nation. We have the money, we have the means, we have the creativity. But the question is, does it reflect who we are and who we want to be? And so today, as you listen to the rest of this presentation and gather with your colleagues and reflect on your service, I want you to invite yourself to answer this really important question. What will your role be as we change history together? What will your role be as we change history together? At this moment, I'm very honored to introduce to you Dr. Tabitha Jones-Levette, who will lead our section on process and outcomes.
Thanks so much, Reverend Ray. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you to Baba Akili. We affectionately call him Baba Akili in our movement work. I also want to say thank you to Nicole, who is providing language justice today for interpretation. I want to talk a little bit with you about process. We've already begun to receive some questions from you in the chat about what are we doing to contribute to society? And I want to answer that question by telling you about the work that we've done to engage in a transformative justice process and thinking about city budgeting, right? And so here's what I want to begin with, because I think that sometimes in presentations like this, it's easy to depersonalize it. You should know that all of us are volunteers. This is what we believe to be our civic duty to engage in these processes, but it's really personal, right? And so I want to invite you for just a moment to think personally. I want you to think about and remind yourself of where you were when George Floyd was subdued by several police officers, most principally Derek Chauvin, who kneeled on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I want you to think about where you were when you saw those images for the very first time. Because what you were seeing was a public lynching that was all too personal, not only to George Floyd, but to his 7-year-old daughter, Gianna, whose words we heard ring around the world, demanding justice. You'll recall, if you paid attention to the prosecution's trial against Derek Chauvin, who was found guilty of murdering George Floyd, you'll recall that the prosecutor let us know that a convenience store worker called the police, alleging that George Floyd had given them a counterfeit bill. Do you remember this very public lynching and where you were when it happened? And what I want you to also ask yourself personally is, do you remember what you did? What was your response when you saw this public lynching for the very first time? Were you among the 26 million people in Los Angeles and all around the globe who took to the streets in the middle, dare I say, of a global pandemic, risking our lives to demand justice in the name of George Floyd, with a really clear and compelling rallying cry to defund the police and reimagine public safety? Where were you? Where were you? When we say defund the police and reimagine public safety, here's what's at the center of our process. We have come to know, we know this with data, with our own lived experience, that the most heavily resourced communities, perhaps some of the communities in which many of you live in, the most heavily resourced communities are the safest ones. Because what keeps us safe, and this is an undergirding premise of our process and outcomes, is the belief and understanding that in order to live whole lives as human beings, in order to live whole lives that allow for us to actually flourish, what helps us to do that, what helps me to do that, perhaps what helps you to do that, is to live in communities where the conditions and resources for your flourishing are abundant. At its core, the People's Budget Coalition is here not for tinkering with marginal reform. We're here for substantive, real, and transformative change. And the reason we say that is because the stakes are too high. The stakes were too high for Gianna Floyd, George Floyd's 7-year-old daughter, when she watched and saw the life choked out of her dad. The stakes are too great for the children of Keisha Michael, who right here in Los Angeles, and Inglewood in particular, was incapacitated and killed by Inglewood police, leaving behind her children along with her partner children, Marquette and Sandlin. The stakes are too great for John Horton's family and Grishario Mack's family. Grishario was having a mental health crisis. What he needed was mental health care workers, but instead he was assassinated in a black mall, something that would never happen on the west side of Los Angeles, in front of families and children. The stakes are too great, and this is why we say, and we'll continue to say, defund the police and reimagine public safety. Next slide. So as we move into talking about our process, it's really important to continue to ground ourselves. And one of the ways that we do this is we have a particular approach to budgeting by centering the voices of the people. As Akili mentioned earlier, one of the things that we have felt is important to really encourage the city to begin to do this, right, is to engage in what we call a participatory budgeting process. This is a well-researched process. Many social scientists really encourage these kinds of processes, and yet all too often our mayors and city councils across the country, but especially here in Los Angeles, fail to engage in these processes where they go directly to the people, whether it's through transformative budget town halls where you hear qualitative data, right? People telling you about their own lived experience and identifying their priorities. And also using quantitative data, the best of what we know in research, particularly social science research, right? That helps us to understand in systematic ways what the will of the people actually is. We think that these participatory budgeting approaches are critical if we're going to actually develop what Reverend Ray talked about, a budget that is rooted in a moral vision for the city. Not only a political vision, not only an economic vision, but a moral vision. Coupled with these participatory budgeting practices, we've also engaged in education. We think it's important to share what we're learning about the budget process so that we can invite more people to get involved. In fact, we want to invite you to become more involved in this process. And it's also been important as part of our process to engage in sort of involving our electeds, those who are willing to actually hear the data that's been systematically collected through this process. And so we've made presentations of this data to City Council, and we've also held collaborative sessions with candidates and electeds to engage new people in the budgeting process. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you can imagine that when we center the voices of the people, we hear patterns in the data. Some of those patterns come in the form of qualitative data. And so you can see, for example, Carlos here says, when we've asked in these participatory town hall meetings, what can we do? What should we do, right? Someone like Carlos says, we're done paying for an institution. And here he's talking about policing that produces racism and violence and poverty. We're done talking. It's time to put our money where the people are. Vanessa says, we don't need police on buses. We don't need them on public transportation. We need people that care about us, actually, right? And Joy says, police show up and they hyper escalate the situation, making matters worse. We need community interventionists that can pull up and de-escalate the situation. Next slide. So we heard these kinds of themes as part of our town hall participatory budgeting processes, gathering data over a systemized period of time. And that really motivated us to invite, in particular, our elected officials to take a participatory budgeting pledge, because a core component of the people's budget is emphasizing that including the people in the budget process is important. So we encourage all political candidates and office holders to sign participatory budgeting pledges to commit to holding a budgeting process that meaningfully engages the people. Next slide. So let me tell you a little bit about now the quantitative data results that we received this particular year when we launched our People's Budget Survey. Next slide. One of the things that we'll spotlight here for this particular budget cycle is that we've been engaged in this process year round because we recognize the urgency of developing a moral budget. It's been important for us to solicit the input of Angelenos across the city to really center the priorities that we hear from the people in the city. And since doing so, we've presented, as I mentioned earlier, to City Council, but most recently we presented in June. And I'll add that we also held 6 public town hall meetings with thousands of participants, including times when we partnered directly with City Council members to do so. So to date, we've collected nearly 4,300 survey responses since April of 2021. And we've had participants, close to 45,000 participants in our town hall meetings. Next slide. So this is an example, again, of the kind of rich data you can get when you have a systematic process. One thing that's been really important for us, of course, in this process is to do what we call in social science, right, to disaggregate data. And all that means is that we want to make sure that the multiple voices that are represented in the city are reflected in the ways in which we both analyze the data, but also share and present the data. And because we care very deeply about the development of a moral budget, at the center of that is our belief that the city's most neglected voices must be heard. The most neglected voices must be heard. And so hearing from essential workers, for example, has been critically important to us. Hearing from folks about their employment status, those who are working, those who've been unemployed for long periods of time. We wanted to make sure that the data itself gave us perspectives from multiple vantage points, including vantage points like race and gender and sexual identity. Next slide. One of those populations that's all too often ignored, including in meetings like this one, which is why it's important to collect data, is to center the voices of those who've been impacted by failed systems. So you should know that among respondents in our survey, 36.3% of respondents actually identified as survivors of crime. Crime is something that we hear lots of people talking about, especially in political moments. So we think it's really important to listen to crime survivors. It was also important for us to hear from those who have been impacted directly by the carceral system, those who've been impacted by jailing, right, and carcerality overall. And so close to 12% of those who participated in this particular study were impacted by the carceral system. And finally, 31.8, almost 32% of those who responded have had a family member impacted directly by the same carceral system. These are voices, again, that are all too often ignored in data collection. We felt it was important to hear from them directly. Next slide. Finally, in terms of disaggregating results, 14.3% of those who responded have been directly harmed by law enforcement. Again, another population that all too often is disregarded when thinking about what it means to create a safe city, right? And finally, 24.3% of those who participated in the study have had a family member in their lives directly harmed by law enforcement. So we think these principles of disaggregating ought to drive how we analyze the data and share our findings. Next slide. 91% of those who participated support nonviolent direct action, the kinds of action that many of us took when George Floyd was murdered in our street. And finally, among the participants in the study, 93% say that police associations should not have a role in the city budget. And so as we hear these things, perhaps things that some of you resonate with and others of you who perhaps are challenged by this data, we really want to encourage you to continue to press forward and listen. Listen to those who took the time to actually complete a survey during a global pandemic when all too many of our fellow citizens in our society, in our city, right, feel that they have something to say that needs to be heard by the people and by City Council and the mayor. Next slide. So here were some of the priorities that we found as patterns in the data. Next slide. There was a universal focus on investing in priorities that centralize people's universal needs. And this should not surprise any of us. Because when we experience housing security, when we have access to public health and healthcare, when we have a robust plan to address and engage climate change and environmental justice, and when we have food security, these are the kinds of things that actually help us to flourish and to thrive. And so among those who responded to our survey, almost 80% of people said, we want to see an investment by the city in the city's budget in housing security. 71% saying we want to see an investment in public health and healthcare. And you can see the additional items here. 63% said we need for your top priority to be an investment in creating food security, most especially for those who are already vulnerable in our city. Next slide. Another area of top priority for investment was reimagining community safety. And so 76% of those who responded to the survey says we need more investment in mental health and wellness support. We want to see an investment in restorative justice models. We want to see community care workers, right? 61% of people said, we want to see community care workers be first responders, not those who show up with guns, right? Ready to shoot. And finally, there was a desire, more than 50% of people said we want to see community investment and investment in neighborhood empowerment. This must be something that you want to hear in your neighborhood councils, that people want to see an investment in neighborhood empowerment. Next slide. The built environment, right? When you think about libraries and parks, when you think about public transportation, right? The places in which we build community. You should not be surprised that more than 60% of people wanted to see an investment in public transportation. Los Angeles is one of the largest cities in the world, as the 5th largest economy in the world, has the worst public transportation. I know I don't have to tell you that. And so it shouldn't surprise us that 62% of people wanted to see an investment there. People want to see more of an investment in our libraries and in parks and recreation. In the fire department, there are fires burning in Northern California now, and we can certainly resonate with what it feels like to be threatened by fire. And also an investment, again, in the built environment related to public works, ensuring that our streets and all of the infrastructure of the communities in which we live are receiving the best care and attention so that we, again, can thrive. Next slide. We also saw patterns in the data related to priorities for divestment. And when we talk about divestment, one way in which you can understand divestment is thinking about the ways in which money has been taken away from our public schools, right? We understand divestment very clearly, but when it comes to talking about divestment from policing, some of us get uncomfortable. But here's what the data showed. Among those who responded, 77% of respondents said we want there to be a divestment from policing. They also wanted to see a divestment in parking enforcement, which is tied to the policing system, right? So 57% of people said, listen, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Why are we getting all these parking tickets, right? So again, these are the kinds of things that we think are important for the city to hear. And of course, finally, people wanted to see a divestment in the city attorney's office. Next slide. So the data demonstrates a consistent message. And, you know, we've said that this message is defund the police and reimagine public safety, but here's the translation that we really want you to hear, if this is new for you. Invest in our universal needs, which means that we must divest from traditional forms of policing. Investing in our universal needs so that we can invest, right? Invest in these needs so that we can divest from policing, because policing is garnering all too much of the budget. That's the problem. Next slide. This is one way that you can think about it. You maybe have seen this slide before. I don't know about you. I love ice cream. Ice cream is something I can really resonate with as someone who grew up with two brothers. We would always, when the ice cream was getting to the very bottom, try to see who had the most in their bowl, right? And so when you look at this depiction, it gives an image that I hope you'll sit with. Right now in the Los Angeles city budget, the police have more than their share of the ice cream. They have all too much money invested in policing, which means that affordable housing and job training, education, mental health care in the middle of a pandemic, right? Treatment for substance abuse, intervention workers and supporting the ways in which they show up in our communities. What that means is that when one part of the budget is concentrated, it starves the rest of the budget. And that's what's happening by investing in traditional forms of policing to the starvation of all of the investments that we heard from people as city priorities for the budget. And so I think what you should know is that there are dueling visions. There are dueling visions of what keeps us safe. In this particular slide, what you see is a vision of safety that is rooted in traditional forms of policing, the kind of policing that led to the murder and lynching of George Floyd, to the murder of Grishario Mack, to the murder of Keisha Michael and Marquentin Sandlin and John Horton. We refute that vision because we know, again, that when you give people what they need to flourish and to thrive, when you build those conditions and invest in that, right? When you put your money where the priorities ought to be, we see again that the most well-resourced communities actually flourish. This is rooted in the belief, a statement that comes from Ruth Wilson Gilmore when she says that life is precious. The vision that you're seeing in the people's budget is this: life is precious. Life is precious because life is precious, because Black life is precious, because the lives of our unhoused neighbors are precious, because the lives of essential workers are precious. We must invest the resources in a care first, people first budgeting process. And when we do so, we actually build the world that all of us, not just some of us, but all of us deserve to live in. So I want to thank you for just listening to this data. And if, again, you find yourself experiencing some internal resistance to it, I just ask you to sit with that resistance and to actually listen to the voices of those that all too often are voiceless in our society. At this time, I now want to invite my colleague, Philip, we call him Rock, Lester, from the Reverence Project to talk with you about what we mean by reimagining public safety.
Yes, good morning, everybody. As we see on the screen, just the term reimagining public safety, what does that like? All right. So what we want to do is kind of, develop a frame, a picture of what does reimagining public safety actually look like. The next slide. So as we go to the next slide, what we see is like almost a definition or an ideal of what reimagining public safety look like. And as we see here, we see investing in prevention, not just a reaction. Prevention is being the key. I was always told that ounce of prevention is better than a cure, or better than a pound of cure. The key thing is prevention and not just investing in a reaction. Next slide. So as we see what reimagining public safety look like, we're talking about investing in the well-being, investing in the well-being of families, investing in preventing crisis, investing in diversifying first response. Now, when we talk about, investing in well-being of families, this entails, as a definition, there's ensuring everyone in Los Angeles have access to safe homes, food, water, healthcare, education, and transportation. These are some of the key things, key components that people are concerned about. Folks are concerned about their homes. We're talking about pandemic. There's so many people as a result of the pandemic is being forced out, right? So people are concerned about that. People are concerned about their food. People are concerned about water. As we've seen when the pandemic started, people were storming just to find water. All over the place, water was being sold out. Education. These are the things that people are concerned about in their communities, quality education, because that leads to better communities and safer communities. So when we talk about reimagining public safety, we have to see it through more than one type of lens. And we have to see that law enforcement is not that lens that actually just the only ideal or way to lead to public safety, education, preventing crisis, funding mental health, physical health programs, youth programs, community programs, the things that actually lead to public safety community. So as we reimagine public safety, this is the stuff that we want you guys to consider and look at. Diversifying first responding to crisis with a range of providers, including medical professionals, social workers, mediators, and mental health workers. These are what, when you respond into a situation, these are the resources that is needed, not law enforcement as a single point of contact. Next slide. So here, as we see, statement again, reimagining public safety. Safety is just not about funding critical services. It's also about defunding the police. And as we look at this and we say, why defunding the police? We don't need law enforcement responding to party and noise complaints. We don't need law enforcement responding to domestic and family conflict. These are the things that is listed here, neighborhood gatherings. And we are exhausting a lot of resources on things that can actually be dealt with by community members. So as we see in the definition here, police presence often turns a nonviolent situation into a violent one. And as was stated earlier, the situation with George Floyd, that was a nonviolent situation that led to something that sent shock waves around the nation. There was people in other countries standing and marching against that act. This was something that was nonviolence. So we need to be considering alternatives and reimagining what do public safety look like. Next slide. So as we see here, we have divest, defund, and invest. And as we continue to call on City Council to reject the mayor's increase of LAPD and to reject any additional funds that LAPD requests. And we're talking about $67 million is this an increase in LAPD. And when we look at that $67 million, how else could that $67 million be looked at? We have communities that is dealing with poverty. We're talking about stark poverty, where $67 million could be invested in a community like Watts, communities like South Central LA. And let's just imagine, what would that look like, an investment in a community like Watts of $67 million, if we just put it on a pilot program for 2 to 3 years, where we have annual investment of $67 million, what would that look like in that community? That can actually the tide of what that community is actually going through. These are the type of investments in which we need. We need to be invested in the people and invested in the community and not just in law enforcement. What we do with law enforcement is we every year we invest more in law enforcement with the idea that there's an uptick in crime, and we invest more in law enforcement, and what we get more violence. We get more upticks in crimes. We don't get solutions, right? So now we need to be figuring out, how do we get more solutions? And it's like what we stated earlier, we have to start investing in youth programs. We start to have to invest in the community. We have to invest in social programs. So this is what the defunding, divest and invest actually looks like. Next slide. So our next slide here, it shows changes like these must be expedited and funded, where we have nonviolent crisis responses. We should be funding nonviolent crisis responses so that we don't have an unfortunate situation, again, like the George Floyd situation or the Eric Garner situation. We should be investing in ways to actually get away from how do we respond in a way that is conducive to the benefit of the community and not law enforcement to where it turns to be something violent. These are actually motions that people are actually want the council to expedite and to actually consider and look into. This is where folks actually want their money invested. So as I was speaking earlier, a participatory budget, people actually through our People's Budget LA survey has clearly stated where they want their dollars to be spent and how they see reimagining public safety and how we can better utilize our dollars in order to create safer environments for the communities in which we all live in. Next slide. So here, through our town halls and surveys, priorities, which I was just stated, these are some of the things where people want to see investment. We're talking about housing, security, These are needs of people. And when we're talking about needs of people and community, housing is a necessity, right? This is where families operate. This is where when people are coming from solid and sound homes, because the family is an extension of community. So when we have good community, we have good housing. In turn, what we have is public safety, right? So people want to see the investment in housing. Also, people want to see the investment in public health care. It is just so essential and crucial that we do have health care and we have public health care. People want to see the investment in mental health care, which is key. A lot of times, sometimes people just need somebody to talk to. People need therapists, people need counselors. We need those type of things in our community, right? In order to make our communities more safe. In addition, people want to see investments in small businesses. We're talking about primarily in some of these communities, like I mentioned, like Watts, where these small businesses are the engines of these communities, right? And we see very little investments in those Black-owned small businesses who can in turn create jobs for the community. That is public safety, providing the needs for what people actually need and actually accommodating those needs. This is what people want to see in the survey. Next slide. Thank you. Investment, support of Black families and children, which is key and crucial. When we kind of like look at a lot of the things that is going on in our communities, this is a result in some cases of some of the lack of resources, the lack of opportunities, and unfortunately, like in the communities that we come from, Black families and children are not supported as much as others, and those are just the facts. We need kind of like a level of equity to where folks are feeling supported. Folks are feeling like they have the things at their disposal to actually help them go forward and actually to grow the family nucleus in a place in which is positive and is conducive again to the success of our communities. Because as I stated before, that community is the extension of family. So we need to actually prioritize on supporting Black families and Black children. Next slide. Also, when we talk about investment, we have to invest in folks who was reentry folks, formerly incarcerated folks. It's a reality of fact that people in our communities, you have folks who have actually had a brush with the law. And these people, or some of these individuals, are now coming home, whether it's been a minor or a major infraction. You have folks now who are actually back in the community and society. And guess what? They want to have a stake in the community and society. They want to actually be a part of. They want to give back. They want to have jobs. They want to own homes. They want to be able to provide for their family. We should actually be investing in them type of folks, right? Because what that does is it leads to public safety. When people have jobs, people have, what you stated before, access, quality care. People have access to equity. We should be considering that, opposing to creating a system to where we're funding all of our dollars towards law enforcement. And what it does is create a lack of resources, and folks who may have had a brush with the law before is finding difficult times, and in some cases wind up creating a situation to where they're back into the system. We should not be creating a system that leads people back to it. Actually, folks coming from a system, they should be able to come into a system to where now they're able to do something positive and actually give back. Next slide. So here we see education, after school, youth programs. This is what folks want to see. That is just so essential. After school programs and education. After school, what is next? A lot of times people don't have nothing to do after school. So we do, in some cases, we find delinquency, right? And this is the result because we have cut programs. We have defunded the schools. We have defunded the schools in order to increase dollars going into law enforcement. We need to now start to reinvest back into the community by divesting and investing and defunding the police and actually putting resources back into education, after school, and youth programs. Next slide. And again, this revolves around access, communities. We should be investing in access and technology to where we just deal with a pandemic, and we've seen so many students to where the schools was even providing students with computers, right? So they had, access to a computer, but they didn't have access to Wi-Fi. Maybe because their parents just couldn't afford Wi-Fi. They couldn't afford it being attached another bill. You have some of these people in the communities that we live with, communities that's in impoverished communities. And the things is, you know, that some cases they're living from one check to the next, right? And an extra bill can actually be something that put them in a position where they can't afford rent. Why are we in a situation where folks don't have access to something as basic as Wi-Fi? Why are we investing in law enforcement and we can be investing in Wi-Fi that opens the door, creates a situation to where students are not falling through the cracks because they simply don't have access to Wi-Fi? This is how we reimagine public safety and make our communities better. Next slide. So here, as we talk about invest into alternative emergency responses. So as we look in here and we're talking about invest into an alternative emergency responses, we can be using mobile mediators, violent disruptors, hotlines, addiction recovery services, etc. These are the things that actually make our communities better. We don't actually have to invest all of these dollars into law enforcement when there's other ways to respond to some of these emergency situations to where it doesn't really require law enforcement. Actually, what they really require is services and providers and care.
Thank you, Rock. And I want to move to, as we come to conclude, what you can do, how we can create a partnership, how we can move together in this approach to divest, invest. The first thing we want to call on the neighborhood councils to do is support the divest. We want you to defund the police in your neighborhood councils, remove cops from your agenda. Don't fund police. It's not a established slogan, it's a policy position. Invest. We want you to invest in Black-led organizations with your budget advocacy. Apply a divest, invest strategy at the city level when meeting with department heads and include it in your budgeting white papers. And finally, engage. Meet with Black Lives Matters and the People's Budget LA to review conditions and status at the beginning of 2022. So we're calling on you to work with us. We want to come back. We want to be able to share more with you, to hear more from you, and to be able to work together so that we can have the kind of Los Angeles we all envision, we all support, and we all want to see. Now, some of us are not always comfortable with the defund, but we all should be comfortable with a better LA. And we get to a better LA when we invest in people, when we invest in communities, when we invest in neighborhoods. And there's one way we can do that through a participatory budgeting process, but more importantly, rethinking, reconsidering, reimagining LA. If you're interested in having a people's budget presentation at your neighborhood council, you can reach out to us. We'll be glad to provide people to help you and walk you through this. But more importantly, sign up for the participatory budgeting pledge. And we want to do this with you. We are calling on you to take action, but we want to support you in that action. I know there's if there are questions in the chat that we have time enough to respond to, we'd like to do that. If not, Freddie, how do we begin to move forward with this? And first of all, I want to also thank all of our presenters who did a great job in trying to clarify and help all of us understand what we mean by participatory budgeting and reimagining public safety. The other thing is we're asking people to do is to let go of yesterday and the status quo and reach for tomorrow, a better LA, a better community for all of us. So if there are questions in the chat that we have time to respond to, if not, then I will turn it back over to Freddie.
Thank you so much. Let's have a virtual round of applause for our presenters. Thank you all for sharing your time to participate in the session. I've put into the chat the link to the 5-question workshop evaluation, so please take a moment to complete that. Remember that at the closing session, we'll announce the 10 winners of this year's Congress of Neighborhoods swag bags, the names that complete the workshop survey. Next on the schedule is the opening session, and I've put our website URL in the chat so you can access the rooms for the next session. Now, to help participate with neighborhood councils, you may go to empowerla.org. I will send again the link in the chat for everyone to see. For this wonderful workshop, if you want to keep engaging, please engage with your neighborhood councils. Again, thank you again and enjoy the rest of the Congress of Neighborhoods. I will be closing this room in 1 minute. So hop over to the website that I just added to the chat and click on that link to go to the next room. Thank you so much.